What?
I'm sorry. Am I boring you with this topic? You don't
You're,
like solution architecture anymore?
you're so exciting, JM, that I'm.
You're back awake. You're conscious again. I see. You have your coffee now? Is that okay?
Yeah, I had coffee. I'm good. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
We're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we've met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Roland. I've had a pretty busy last couple weeks. So for those of you who don't know on the podcast, besides doing this and doing my job and all those sorts of things, I also run a charity, and that's focused on music education for young kids who are coming up in the world of a cappella. I've never really stopped performing. And so this week has been my festival here in Toronto, the Sing Festival, singtoronto.com for lots of information on all the fun festivities. But as you might imagine, that makes me a tired person. So I'm pushing through, my friend. It's been an interesting time. We've had some fantastic artists from around the world, but now I'm here with you talking about something very different.
Isn't the festival over at the point of time when this episode will be released?
It's true. But I think it's good for folks to know the context behind why maybe I'm not quite as chipper as I'd usually be, or maybe more sort of frantic and all over the place. We had a really cool announcement that came like late breaking that the mayor is going to show up to one of our festival events, which is fantastic. So I'm going to get a chance to see her and maybe shake her hand this evening, which would be fun.
Ooh, you will never wash your hand again. But either way, JM, I think this is not the topic of our episode today.
It is not.
Because we will talk, I hope, we will talk about use cases for business process management. And hint, there might be an episode in the future where we'll talk about use cases for enterprise architecture, but that is not the topic of today.
No, and I think this is important. You'll notice this is not an interview show. This is one where Roland and I get a chance to go through some of the things we think about on a daily basis. It's all well and good to think about technology as a solution to solve all your problems. But as we like to talk about in a lot of these shows, first you want to think about the problems you're trying to solve. Don't buy a tool assuming that it's going to solve, quote unquote, your company. It doesn't. It solves aspects of what challenges you might be facing. It provides value to you in certain specific areas, and those are formulated into use cases, value cases, the thing you'll put on a value proposition slide that gives you the incentives, the reasons, the firepower to entice an executive to invest in this program.
Yeah, I think there's also another aspect of this. When I deal with clients, a lot of them that just get started and they don't know. And I literally had a client once said that to me, like, Roland, you have to tell us what we should do with your tool. After they bought it. That was an interesting experience. So it's also the idea that we can help somebody who tries to figure out for him or herself if process management is the right thing for their organization or what they're going to do with it. And maybe we give you some ideas, one or two, and align it to two things. One is to maybe a maturity curve. Right. So if you get started to where we got it organized to up, everything is running smoothly and has 20,000 feedback loops. But also, maybe more importantly, and I suggest we start with that, with the process lifecycle, which we have spoken, and it fell out of my mind which episode it was, but I will put it in the show notes. The process/solution lifecycle, because that is something relatively static that doesn't change. So, JM, why don't you kick us off with a little bit of reminder on what the solution lifecycle is?
Certainly. So first, let's talk about the solution lifecycle as how it's built, as above and below the water line of what we consider design and execution. Mm-hmm. And it depends on where you start the conversation. But for a lot of folks in business and enterprise architecture, we tend to think of starting the conversation. I know it's too late. We start the conversation at solution design. And if we're going to start with solution design, what that is all about blueprinting, transition state. A transition state, giving yourself the views of process and architecture that is what you aspire to, something that will help to drive your organization forward. And as that moves from design to execution, that's when we talk about implementing your blueprints, your solutions. That implementation can take the form of automation, as it often does in very highly automated or transactional systems in business. It can also take the form of standard operating procedures, changing the ways of working of your employees. And then, of course, as you implement that, you will run your business. We think of that as process execution. So how am I actually going to make things happen, sell products, support customers, run my business?
Mhm.
And then I'm looking to measure and analyze all those executions that I'm putting in there. Historically, that's been done through things like time and motion studies, but nowadays, a lot of times that's through BI and process mining. And that process mining should inform and connect back to our solution design through this interlock of context. So high level design program roadmaps for how this execution and the results match up with the design and planning for another transition state of the business as you constantly update things. So we see solution design, implementation, process execution, measurement and analysis, and high level design and program roadmap as sort of a round a circle that continues over and over again. As I said, it's a life cycle. It's meant to be a continuous life cycle in solution design, solution and solution implementation for organizations.
Which I find very interesting that you started with solution design. But for those of you who don't look at the slides that JM and I look at while we're recording this, I will obviously post those in the show notes of this episode, which is also something like an anniversary jubilee episode, 70.
Yeah, 70. We're getting old,
anyways,
Roland.
You get old. I get wiser. But anyways, so we're going to post this stuff obviously in the show notes. So you see the visuals and you can follow then obviously the use cases when we look at it. Let's get started with it. And let me take the first one. When you think about the graphic, this is why I said it's a little bit unusual that you start with solution design, because to me, that's step number 2. Step number 1 is actually that dark blue bubble that you will see that says high level design and program roadmap. The enterprise baseline, the repository of your processes, your apps, your risks, all that place where you go. And what I see when I think about the first use case is a lot of organizations who have that gut feeling they need to do something. They think about, oh yeah, I know we're doing something. Organizations do processes or do have a landscape. There must be a better way of managing this, or do we need to manage this, right? So they reach out to us to help them in getting a structure in place where they can document their processes, for example, right? So these are the guys who think about, oh yeah, currently I do have an Excel sheet, or then guys who say, oh yeah, let me draw a Visio diagram, and they come up with some own shapes and whatnot. And as you know, because we've spoken about this in the podcast more than once, that's a very early stage. There are standards for process modeling, for example, right? So I think the first use case is documentation. And then when you think about it, publishing, right? Make it available to everyone. And then obviously, as you said before with SOP, standardization. So JM, talk to me a little bit when you think about that very, very narrow use case, what you've seen in the past for people who get started with that documentation, publishing, and standardization use case.
Yeah, I wanted to loop back a little bit on what you said about the gut feeling, because I think that's a great place to start, because it kind of leads into this documentation, standardization, and publishing. This gut feeling that something is wrong, that you could be doing something better. I think it permeates organizations, and it's found both at an individual executor. So individuals can sort of throw up a flag and say something is wrong. First, I want to write it down. So I want to be able to prove that something is wrong. That gut feeling needs to have something that allows them to latch on to a project or initiative to actually expose the scope of their issue. So that's documentation, is particularly as is side.
Yeah, and maybe you have to.
Oh yeah.
Those damn regulators that want to see something, or your organization wants to be ISO certified or whatnot.
Oh yeah.
You need some form of documentation.
Absolutely. And that's the first piece of the puzzle. Something gut feeling is wrong. However, this starts to permeate through an organization. An individual contributor has thrown a flag up. but they themselves don't necessarily have all the skills or context to solve it themselves. In fact, quite the opposite. Oftentimes they're seeing only one part of the picture. And that's where the collaboration and solutioning comes into place. So you've written what you've seen down, and then you bring other people in to try and help inform what you've seen, to center it in the business reality, to
Mhm.
anchor it to strategic pillars, and to give you the tools you need to solve it with everyone in mind. Roland, you and I talk about this all the time. You solve a problem at step 3 of a 10-step process and you ruin steps 4 through 7, you've created a bad outcome for the business, even if it looks good on your particular step.
Agreed. Yeah, you need to make it visible. I think that's the main part, right? Bring
Mm-hmm.
something to hopefully a virtual piece of paper, sometimes a real piece of
Yes.
paper. Make it visible, because then you can start thinking about, okay, where do we improve? Where do we have problems? Where do we measure what? You know. But
Yeah.
the funny thing is, and I worked back in the late '90s. Oh, should I say that? How old I am? Anyways, late '90s. I worked on a project with a big telecommunication company in Germany. For those of you who know, there was only one,
Mm.
and we were creating processes, and the client said, "Oh, my employees, they cannot read diagrams." So we literally sat there
Okay.
with Word 95, and we were writing long documents, and it was a full network of documents. And then you need to know, oh, if we say we want to change this standard phrase, well, you need to know where else in which documents there was. It trust me, it was a pain. It was a pain, right?
I
So
do.
so what I see is the next step is clients using this in Excel, right? Because a table, right, might be easier for the nerds on us. It might be cyborgish and whatnot, but you have some
Sure.
structured data, right? I think the best way to do this is obviously drawing diagrams, right? Visual. There's standards out there, as I said before, and to do this in a multi-user environment, right? Because one
Yes.
thing that you will see is, and I had a client last year, their problem was that they needed to create processes for regulators, and they had Visios on SharePoint, and
Yeah,
then
it's
their
not going to work.
SharePoint was outdated and whatnot. So
Mm-hmm.
they migrated to our tool and whatnot, you know. But I think that the benefit is if you use a proper tool for this. And again, we had a different episode about which tool to choose,
Tool
or
selection.
tool selection. Yes, you have some process behind it, you know.
Yes.
So you have some form of create the damn thing, do QA, have it reviewed, publish it, version it, and all those type of things. And I think that is the point where you move from that low maturity maybe to a higher maturity, because then you ask the question, well, who's supposed to do what, and what are the rules of the game, you know? And then
Yeah.
you come to that last point, like, oh, if we do this and we do it all the same, well, shouldn't we standardize? And JM, maybe you can talk about that a little bit more.
Well, I think you mentioned the word that's so important here, which is visibility, right? Standardization
Mm.
doesn't come about by working in silos. That is literally the opposite of what we're trying to do. So when you mention governance, they're sort of tacitly mentioning governance. We mentioned collaboration. We mentioned visibility. That's a road towards standardization. So being aware of how people are doing the same process differently, and then making a collective decision on what way works best for the organization, and standardizing everyone. So dictating how each of these various ways of doing things is going to come into alignment. Of course, you're managing exceptions. Of course, you're managing variance by different particular groups like specialist needs. But I got to put a note out to everyone out there, and it might hurt to hear this, but it's absolutely accurate. For the most part, the majority of your processes are not special. You are not special.
That hurts
You
me.
may think you are special, but you are
That
not.
hurts my feeling. You know, my mom tells me that every day.
But here's the thing. If you think you are special and you think that your needs are so different from everyone else's needs that you can't possibly standardize on their processes, you are creating a mindset barrier to accepting a new way of thinking, a better way of working, and something that the organization actually uses to collectively improve on how they do business.
Yeah.
You need to have that open mind and thinking you're special and it's unique to you. I'll make an example of this a lot of this company that I used to work for that was a transportation company, and they were doing lots of different types of transportation, but particularly one of the transportation arms that worked in the rail industry. They really struggled because every conversation started with, we're rail, we're different. You can't talk to us like you talk to over the road. You can't talk to us like you talk about cargo or freight on air freight or things like that. You can't do that. And the
Mm-hmm.
truth is that you could. And they were simply putting a barrier to improvement. So as each other group improved, they lagged behind and lagged behind. And the conversations got more and more terse as senior executives came down and looked at them and said, like, guys, you have to accept our enterprise standards. We see the performance improvements those bring.
Yeah, I had a similar experience also 20 years ago when I was working with the German Armed Forces on a ERP implementation, so SAP, and that how do I say that? That implementation in the beginning did not went swimmingly. Right up to a point where they said, "Oh no, military organizations are so different from regular organizations that a standard commercial off-the-shelf application does not fit," which we call BS. So they needed to get into the standardization. But one thing, and that's a little shout out to some co-podcasters. We had Kaspar Jans twice on the show, and Kaspar is running his own podcast called BPM 360. For those of you who don't know where it is, I will put some links in the show notes. But he made the point in, I think, his last episode where he says, "Look, there are different types of processes." Right. Yeah. There's as you alluded to, JM, there's the value add, right, which gives you a business benefit, which you should specialize and work on it like crazy. But then there's also the standard processes that have no value add, and you should standardize them and drive down the cost and do them as effective and cost conscious as you can.
Yeah, non-differentiating processes. Don't fight. Don't make those fights about non-differentiating processes, because they're just they're the piping. Make sure your piping is good enough and learn from each other. And I wanted to talk the next piece of the puzzle here on the why I'm rolling. So what does it look like when you transition from the high level solutioning and road mapping into a specific solution design itself? Like what does that movement look like, and how does the collateral change?
I think it's a little bit, I would phrase it a little bit differently, and we're looking at the same slides, obviously. I think there's the first use case is, just to repeat it, documentation, publishing, and standardization. But at this point in time, we're just looking at one process, right? JM, you're responsible for X. You do this, and you don't care about the rest. I think the next growth phase is when, and Michael Schenk will now get warm and fuzzy feelings, is when you look at a bigger picture, when you look at something like a process inventory, where we do more than one process, right? And then the question comes up, well, how do I organize this? Right? Yeah. Do I create folders on a SharePoint and save everything there? How far could you get you with this? Or do you use a relational database to do this? Or do you just don't care? You just pile up stuff. But that is typically because then you see how upstream and downstream processes relate to each other, right? And you will see processes on different levels of aggregation, if you will. Well, that leads then to the question, well, how can we improve our processes maybe with a wider lens? How do we do the analysis? And I don't want to say value chain analysis, but how do we do the analysis with a bigger picture? How do we identify the variance that we see while not looking just at a single process? How do we see the same process done in other parts of our organization? Right, so on and so forth. So I think it's like a mini circle, right? You document, you publish, you standardize, and then you take the bigger picture. You do that high level analysis, but also lower level analysis of your process and see where are redundancies. How can you improve this? How can we harmonize these things?
Yeah, and I think when I think about solution design moving towards that, I also think about getting a little bit more technical. So when I'm getting into this, I want to understand how this is going to be executed, the systems that I'm going to be using, the human resources that I'm going to be interfacing with, asking to change their ways of working or giving them new systems and screens that they're going to have to learn. I'm thinking about the practicality of handoffs and the change management that's going to need to go
Mhm.
into making sure those things are seamless, both on a human side as well as on a system side. So now I'm looking at integration architecture that's going to support the new process flow. I actually had a client just today ask me a question, how do you see process flow and data flow interacting with each other? And I said, well, they're kind of the same thing. I mean, as you execute a process, the data that will be created or read or updated or deleted, the sort of CRUD acronym people use, during a process will mirror the flow of transactions or steps in your process done by people. And that's part of the solution design you're putting in place to propose that transition state to how you're going to execute your business. That's important.
Yeah, but that is well, I wouldn't say it's the same. It's two facets that are related to each other. But that's the purist in me. Anyways, so I think this is where you go and you look um, at the individual process. But I think the next use case
Yes.
that we have is what people typically see as process improvement, as a generic
Mm-hmm.
initiative in an organization, where you then look at your inventory and your repository, your enterprise baseline, however you want to call that thing, and then systematically try to figure out, okay, where can we improve? Right. This now
Right.
brings together the differentiating, non-differentiating processes, all that type of stuff that we just spoke about, but it brings also the aspect of, oh, we have a shared set of criteria. We have a shared
Yeah.
vision of what a good process looks like. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I mentioned that in a previous episode when we spoke about process mining. Um, there's some levels of a process that you could have, and I try to be cute. Remember the 5 C's, you look for capacity, right? How
Mm-hmm.
many widgets can I push through this process, like contracts to be underwritten in a financial institution or widgets literally be built in a manufacturing process. The second one is course of time. And again, if you have a better word for it that starts with a C, let me know.
I
Uh,
keep pitching clock. I like
no,
the
I don't
word of
like that.
clock.
No, anyways, it's how long does it take? Do we have delays there?
Mm-hmm.
Then we do have cost, right? I think that
Yep.
goes without saying. You want to capture this. You do have custom experience, which we will
Yes.
talk about a little bit later. How
Mm-hmm.
nice is it to do that thing, and it's compliance, which we also will talk a little bit about later. But I think that the key aspect of that use case is you start with that shared understanding of what a good process looks like, and then you try to optimize it over your whole portfolio, your whole baseline, your whole process inventory, so that overall you get better.
Yeah, and I think this is where you also start to bring in a little bit of that data element. When you look at an enterprise baseline, that often includes, to me, the starting conversations around benchmarking,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very good to see what you're doing right now, but it's harder to understand whether or not that process is moving slowly compared to your competitors, compared to standard process runs. And that's where I've seen things like AI or this sort of auto benchmarking that goes into good mining and process improvement suggestion tools really come into play, because that's going to give you an understanding of, is this an anomalous amount of time spent processing an invoice, or is this reasonable for your industry? And sometimes you'll get that from best practice organizations like consulting companies, and sometimes you'll just pull that from stats that you might get from AI.
Yeah, which is actually a good point, because this is the first use case that does not happen just in one of those 5 circles that we spoke about. It
Yeah,
literally stretches 3 of them. You mentioned process mining as part of measure and analyze,
sure.
where you try to figure out, okay, what's wrong with my as is, right? It affects the enterprise baseline. Where does it happen, and are there upstream, downstream stuff, and it actually affects the future state, right? Where you look at how do I want to change this? And then when you think about it, benchmarking, which I like that idea, right? Um, what is a good target criteria for my process? Right. And you
Hmm.
use simulation for this, right? So you
Sure.
tweak your process in a way that you meet those benchmarks.
Also, I think this is going to refer back to what you said before, Roland, which is strategic alignment, because a common
Yeah.
problem I think both you and I faced a lot is people who see great ways of improving their business and forgetting that that's not something anyone cares about. Like moving
Yeah.
20% faster in a process that doesn't really cost a lot or isn't of strategic importance to the business. I mean, it's a nice to have, and it's so hard to get nice to haves funded, particularly in today's incredibly budget conscious environment.
Yeah, that's why I obviously the first blue bubble, high level strategy and roadmap is the key for that. So now with process improvement, what do you get? You get a big pile of ideas, right? Oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, this stinks. This is something that we need to fix. Oh, we could imagine we can fix it like this, right? But where things come, where the rubber meets the road, is actually where you want to trigger the change, right? And that could be, as we've said before, it could be a system implementation or could be an org change or whatnot. And a reasonable organization would take a step back and would do a proper solution design for this. Right. So SAP back in the day called it business blueprint and technical blueprint. I like those things very much because it gives you the idea of a real architect on a construction site. So you don't do things just because, right? Which I've seen way too often in IT organizations. Good idea. Let's do this. And you plan your change, right? And when you do this now, your system implementation, you take your blueprint, you talk to the different domain experts. When we talk about different roles, like a solution architect as the person who keeps the different trades together, your process people, your data people, your org people, your app people, whatever, right? But also then produce something that an execution engine, a runtime tool, can use.
Yeah.
Right. So this is why you don't want to have your homemade shapes in Visio. You want to use something like BPMN, because in the back of the beast, this thing is also an exchange format, right? So that you can take that process, shoot it over in the runtime system, and you configure it, and you don't have to redo it.
And you can do that manually if you really wanted to, but I think both of us have seen where the as designed and the as implemented, there's a huge break between those two things. And then you'll see that end in runtime. Like I worked with a big manufacturing company that had a ton of decisions that were made by IT that had nothing to do with the business that they ended up having to suffer through because the system was implemented literally counter to the way that the business had intended it, but they just hadn't had this proper functional requirements discussion. The handoff was essentially throwing it over the wall and saying, implement what we told you to. And there wasn't a good communication language. There was no interchange. It sucked.
Yeah. At one of my previous employers, we were building an importer from a competitor tool into our tool. And we were dealing with the development guys and whatever, a product manager and whatnot. And he says, oh, let me do this. I'm a product manager. I can handle that. Unfortunately, he was very close to development, and we had allocated time from an external developer, so limited budget.
Sure.
And he made them go through different authentication things and all that IT mumbo jumbo, that at the end of the money, right, to be very blunt, at the end of the money and at the end of the time, I said, where are my requirements being implemented? Where are the custom attributes that I wanted to see in the importer? Oh, we didn't get to this. Right. And that was definitely something that was not a great experience. Even though it was well meant, I don't blame the product manager, but it's like, oh yeah, these are the guys I hang with every day, and they're talking about authentication. And of course, my importer needs to have a good authentication. Right.
Yeah.
Even though the alternative could have been, no, you do a local importer. Screw it. It runs locally. You import diagrams from your competition, and then you export them as BPMN and import them into the central tool. Ta-da! Magic. So, anyways, so what I like to say is, I think that the use case, system implementation or changes, I think it covers design. It covers the implementation part, but as you rightfully said, so there might be a discrepancy between what was designed and what was implemented. And good tools have some mechanism to resolve this, right? Like a governance workflow. And at another previous employer of mine, we had actually a process that we call model to execute, where you model in one tool and then you send it to the runtime tool, and the IT guy developed something, but before it went live, it had to go back to the business person who checks if everything runs, and if he didn't like a change, he said, no, I don't like that change, and it was pushed back, whatever, right? People hated it, never went anywhere because it was too complex. But I think it was a good way going forward. Well, JM, I think we should try something new now, and typically you do the things that you bring our guests into the break, and I just have a power play here. So let me do this now that we've spoken about documentation and publishing and standardization. We've spoken about process inventory and analysis. We spoke about process improvement. We spoke about system implementation. Now my head starts to explode. So we have way more use cases for you. But before that, dear listeners, you might want to think about those 4 use cases that I just mentioned. How do you do that? Do you still use the Visio or the spreadsheet? Do you use something else? What would be the right fit for your organization to capture all that information that we've spoken about and will speak about? And with that challenging question, we leave you alone for a moment and come back right after this.
And we're back. But I think that there's one more burning question. Roland, you had something on your mind before we went to break. What are you looking for?
So, JM, now that we have designed our processes and we have implemented our processes and we resolved the problem between the potential discrepancy between what was designed and what was implemented, with whatever, what are the next thing that you do? Besides having a big party after go live.
Well, we are going to have a big party, but that party is start of a new process or a new part of the process, which is about rolling it out and supporting that rollout through the information you've already captured and through the expertise that you've accumulated as people who are involved in design, solutioning, and who are connected to the change management side of things. I mean, I got to be honest with you, rollout support has a lot of different components to it. But I think the first and most important one starts with the idea of communication. You are going to become the hub of information about what is actually changing, how it's going to affect the various stakeholders, and what they're going to need to learn in order to execute their process excellently after rollout is complete.
What a weird concept.
Supporting people, I know.
Yeah.
But, you know, we say it over and over again. Every show, we say if the person behind the keyboard doesn't want to do the process, well, guess what? It's not going to get done. If you don't plan for rollout support, and I mean, we've talked about change management before. We've talked about the whole, the whole idea of giving people what they need at a timely fashion and communicating well with them and having experts in the business and all these sorts of things. But the truth is that it's still often a forgotten part of things, of the rollout of your processes. If you dump something on somebody's plate, you say, hey, it's Monday. Welcome to a new way of doing things. Here's your 200-page manual that was prepared by IT. Good luck. Your business won't change. Or if it does, it's more likely to change in a negative way than a positive way.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects where you can reuse the stuff that you did in the previous use case, your business blueprint and your technical blueprint. So one is, as you said, communication, what has changed. The other one is org design. You have processes, you have roles, you have a change where does it make sense to move now role X and those 50 people who have that role into a different org unit? And what are the implications? But your org design people will be happy to have a justification to say, oh yeah, we do this because the process has changed, right? Or you're training people, they will look at it and literally, I've seen that in SAP implementations, you run a report on your diagrams, and guess what? It gives you the steps by role and the assigned transaction. So now you know, oh, if I have role X, this is what I have to teach them. And then you can take a step back and build your curriculum and build your training material or e-learning or whatever, and just do that.
It's also about establishing the work you've already done in design as an operational job aid. So the center of truth that you've established as part of your road mapping and strategy design, as part of your harmonization and consolidation, as part of your solutioning, as part of your collaboration, as part of your business and IT handoff, all that work is still valuable, but now to the end user. Now, you might have to refactor it, so rendering it in a new way that's easier to access, but providing asynchronous access to the information you've developed through the implementation process is really, really valuable in making it stick with your end user.
Yeah, and there's two aspects to it. So the more traditional one is creating SOPs. Right, like I said before, the QM people, the whatever regulators might want to see this. You would create them from your diagram. So you have one source of truth, which is the diagram, and then you press a button, and it spits out whatever documentation you need. The other thing is, which I find very interesting, and I haven't seen really happening in real life yet. I've seen some early stages of that. Is, well, how do I support workers who don't sit in front of a screen? Right.
Yes.
So what are different outputs? Can the AI whisper in your ear via your smart glasses and give you an augmented picture of how to change the oil in the wing of an aircraft if they have oil in there?
There's whole workshops. I went to a seminar on reaching remote workers. How do you bring them into the fold? It's a big challenge, finding ways of broadcasting information to people who aren't on their laptop every day and refreshing that information as it changes, as new ways of working are implemented. Because remember, this is a solution lifecycle, not a solution one time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's only a one time if you wear your Apple Vision Pro, driving with 65 miles per hour in your Cybertruck and studying the disadvantage of using the autopilot in high traffic.
No, don't do that.
That could be a one-way trip,
No, but so now we've supported the rollout. And as a note for you, we had a conversation with a few different change management people. Jehan Adam was a really good example of one of those folks. Great episode. We can put it in the show notes as well. But there is a profession around this, and they can be a good collaborator. We keep talking about visibility and collaboration, but I see the solution lifecycle as also sort of a nice prompt for a stakeholder map. Who needs to be involved at each step of this process? And change management during the system implementation, involving change management, even sometimes during process improvement, can help to understand what's feasible for people to change. How are they going to have to change? Give them the advance warning and the collateral that they can use to develop their own renderings, their own plans on how they're going to roll this out to the people that they care most about, your end users. And in fact, I would say you care a lot about too.
Yeah, and maybe the last point of this rollout support use case is, especially when you're in a highly regulated industry, healthcare, finance, pharma, that type of stuff. When you change a process, the database-driven tools, they do typically have a governance workflow around read and understood, approval stuff. So you show up in the morning, you get pinged and said, oops, there's a new process in place. Please read, right? And you have to press a button to confirm so that the organization can show to the regulator, hey, we educated our people.
And now that we're getting into this idea of rolling out and checking back and helping support, that check back thing does matter, because now we're going to run this process in reality, and we're going to start to do some collection of insights on its performance and on its exception or issue that you need to address. And I wanted to split this next section into two, because process execution and its coordinate of measure and analysis does have two ways of looking at it that I think lead to different actions and in some cases lead to different long-term decision making.
Enlighten me. What are those two things?
Well, the first one is all about perishable insight generation and response. And so this is what people think of traditionally as BI. And those BI tools are often meant to give you the fuel you need to act immediately. There are also tools out there that use artificial intelligence to respond, or they use automated sort of if this then that response engines to try and correct process execution errors or non-compliance or issues. A good example, that I work with a major company that was doing renewals, and they were noticing that a lot of their contract renewals were not having a proper person assigned in a timely fashion in order to address that. So the renewal was just passing them by. And that was bad. That was something that was causing an issue. Now, I know there's an underlying structural problem, but frankly, that doesn't matter. If a contract renewal passes and it's gone, then we have to now backfill that and have to figure out how we can remediate this process. That's much more costly. So what they had in place was an automated system that was using data, execution data. It turns out it was actually using process mining data, but we'll talk about that in a second. In order to, in the case it was 30 days, no owner had been assigned, a renewal was coming up, it was going to assign an owner, automatically create a renewal in their tracking system. They was going to notify that owner and notify the manager that there was no person assigned to this renewal. There's a lot of things that it went through. And if in 15 days prior to renewal that they hadn't had an action, it was going to escalate, unassigning the person and just assigning the manager to solve this problem. So this is really a remedial thing. That, or in some cases, it's substantially faster than that. Perishable insights can last for seconds, even milliseconds in cases of high volume transactional businesses. So these are things that are taking business data and acting on it immediately. Doesn't solve the process problem, but it does solve the operational problem that is being created by it. That is one aspect. The other is taking this kind of data, using it as a historical sort of bastion to try and understand where the root causes that require that you take remedial action come from. And that should necessarily lead itself to structural change, something like process, architecture, people change to address the issues you find in the data.
Yeah, there's a blend, maybe. The way how you explained it is more the typical process mining analysis use case. There's also and I put it on the slide and called it execution monitoring, right?
Yeah.
It's that, hey, if you have long running cases, the case is complete. It just took forever. So that you have that systematic thing that you then get still an alert. Might not be the operational guy who gets the alert, but the technology is the same. You get an alert for somebody who's responsible to say, hey, why does those shipment processes from that location in Southeast Asia take so long? You might want to have a look at it, So that could be either within the process, an SLA that's not met, or it could be the overall processing time, that then over a certain amount. So I agree. So there's that immediate need of doing something versus the long-term structural higher level whatever monitoring, if you will.
Exactly. And also noting which is important. I find a lot of organizations do process mining substantially more frequently than they need to in order to do systemic process change, because they think that they're doing the other one. They're like, oh yeah, I'm going to use process mining and execution monitoring as a mechanism of action. And it's like, okay, but that's not really what it's meant for. Or I'm going to change based off of the baselining that I'm discovering in my statistics. And it's like, okay, sure, that's fair. But how are you responding to the problems you have right now? Oh, well, it's like you can conflate the two fairly easily.
But isn't that the same logic that we discussed between use case 2 and use case 3, from the process analysis to process improvement? Because yes, you build that stuff in mining and obviously you want to use it, right? But you quote unquote optimize and sub-optimize and sub-optimize always the same thing, Isn't it rather time to have a wider look and say, yeah, I think we looked at it more enough. Now it goes into some form of steady state, and we're relying on the alerts, and we have a regular review of this thing, every year instead of every 5 seconds. And we focus on a different area within our overall process landscape to use process mining and those technologies there.
Well, that's why we connect this back in to high level design and roadmap. Because at
That
a
is true.
certain point in time, you need to understand whether or not the process mining you're doing and the optimization you're doing still aligns with your organizational objectives. Like if you are trying to achieve an objective, let's say you wanted to reduce the waste in your process by 30%, and you
Mhm.
get to 28%, and you're like, oh my goodness, like I found, like I've stopped the rework, 28% of the fewer cases require extra human touches, or the more touches orders or whatever. That's fine, I get that. Does that 2% to get to that target, is it worth it to the executives to make that number versus moving on to a different part of the
Yeah.
process, which is customer facing and causing people to walk away, and that you can spend your time on? Because frankly, we don't have an unlimited number of resources working on process improvement. That's actually one of the biggest bottlenecks and constraints of this whole discipline, is that oftentimes these teams are fairly small because everyone's trying to keep the lights on, and these people are looking in and figuring out whether or not they can make those lights work better.
Well, well, JM, in a few years we have AI doing this and we're all unemployed. So, anyways,
I
just
don't,
kidding.
I don't, I don't actually believe that though, Roland, because I think that the AI still struggles with motivational interconnectivity.
Didn't you and I give a presentation the other day literally called "Who's the Sidekick Now?" You know, come on.
we did, but I think that the winner here is always going to be a human context, understanding the motivations behind action, being able to align that with strategy, and ultimately being able to see what you want to deliver and how you're going to get there laid bare so you can make human decisions for human consumers.
So we got 4 more use cases, and
Let's do it.
the first one has to do with people, JM. You know, I know that this is one of your favorite ones. You know, talk a little bit to me about customer experience.
Yeah, I think so. I think customer experience as a discipline is interesting, and I think it falls into one sort of 3-piece section of this 5-piece pie that you might not expect. But when I started working with customer experience management people, I found that a lot of times they weren't necessarily designing end processes as much. In fact, quite the opposite. They were mostly providing advisory services to help shape experiences, and the levers that they were using included process, but that wasn't necessarily where they ended their journey. It wasn't like necessarily the focal point that they were going towards. More specifically,
Mhm.
they ended up like taking execution data. So they would be using execution data from the transactions they were seeing in the systems, plus a huge amount of external information collected through things like net promoter score from customer survey, to try and inform this measure and analyze part as a really good starting point. So, where are our customers struggling with interacting with us? Where are the products we're offering not meeting their demands? Where is the service that we are providing them? Where is their interaction pattern, or their journey, as they'll call it, not leading to good customer experiences and outcomes? And so their endpoint they often focus on is the high level design and program road mapping. And so, how am I seeing customer journeys centered in the business? Where does it align to our strategic pillars and our visions and objectives? And how do I create an ideal customer experience that will then inform my business partners to help them change their ways of working, the systems that we use, and the people we have deployed to support our customers? And that's cool. So those 3 pieces: execution, measure and analysis, and high level design and roadmap, is often what I see as part of customer experience design.
Yeah, I agree. You could see them like, okay, I don't get into the details. You know, my black turtleneck might get dirty. You know, and I'd rather go back in my studio to do something.
Oh, Roland, the customer experience people, they
Oh, they hate me now. They hate me now.
no, they get the dirtiest of all, because they're the ones who are literally going to every part of the business, particularly when you have customer experience, but the customer is internal. I've seen some really great teams who do that, where they literally go like floor to floor trying to understand the employee experience. And they're the ones like putting in the hours on their feet. I mean, if they have a pedometer, they're the ones taking 10,000 steps a day at
Mhm.
the office, which is crazy. So I give them a lot of credit, and they're in excellent shape. So
Yeah,
that's a good use case for their life. So we talked about customer experience management, but I wanted to also talk about other stakeholders in this, because you have a lot of experience besides the internal and external customers, talking about one of the biggest people who looks in on process, and that is
Mhm.
standards bodies and regulatory obligations. So tell me a little bit about how you see that in the life cycle.
Oh well, oh well. So when you think about this, in my mind, it mostly happens in the design bubbles, above the
Hmm.
water, even though it's not the inverted iceberg, the bigger part is above the waterline. So what I see is regulators, when you think about it, they typically think in the concept of three lines of defense. Right. For those of you who are not so familiar with it, the first line of defense is the business units, operations. Those are the guys who need process diagrams, and they identify, oh, on this step, this risk can occur, which they pull from a risk catalog somewhere. And this is the control or controls that we use to mitigate that risk, right? Which also come from somewhere. And that somewhere is the second line of defense, which is basically the organization that runs the whole risk management function, if you will. So those are the
Hmm.
guys who are responsible for providing those catalogs, which typically are on multiple levels, to make the relationship to controls, to rationalize all those things that, for example, one branch doesn't call a risk or control risk of tripping over your shoelaces, and the other one calls it open shoelaces are risky, because they're the same, right? So doing this background work, and they're
Hmm.
also obviously are responsible for defining the tests. How do I test the effectiveness of the controls, and which type of controls are there, and so on and so forth, right? You see typically tools like Metric Stream and Archer and all those tools being used for that type of work. And the third line of defense is then and now there's different flavors of it, is the internal and external testation, if you will. Your internal auditors, your external auditors, an independent look at if the risk and controls management actually works. Right. So they go
Hmm.
literally look at how a process is executed. What do people actually do? How is it designed? Is there discrepancy? Do we see risks that materialize? What are the um, disadvantages, the financial implications of if this risk happen, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth, right? And they obviously do write-ups with their observations and all that type of stuff that then the other lines of defense have to work on, close those gaps, on this. And when I lay this over our little solution lifecycle graphic, it would cover obviously the high-level design and roadmap, our enterprise baseline, because that's the place, use case two, the place where all those things live, the catalogs, the processes, the inventory, the relationships, all that type of stuff. It also goes into the solution or in the individual design of a process, you know, um, to say, okay, these are the 5 steps that happen in that process. And it goes into that measure and analyze phase, because what you can do is with tools like process mining is take your solution design, your future state process, upload it, and do a conformance check to see, oh yeah, does that data that we get from our runtime engines, does that really reflect how the work is executed, as it's
Hmm.
noted down on that BPMN diagram. And that, to close it out, might then lead to additional improvement opportunities that then start the whole circle again.
Yeah, the thing that I care most about here, Roland, because these are obviously like specific, like discipline activities that people have to do. The thing that I care the most about in this is that the work that they're doing is still part of the same life cycle, sort of part of the same environment, often part of, with the
Mhm.
same artifacts. Because I've seen so many organizations, and I think you'll probably agree on this, where the risk and compliance activities, these regulatory obligation satisfaction activities, are done as a separate conversation to solution design, to high level program roadmaps. They're not leveraging it.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense at all.
It's such a waste. Like you've done all this work to outline your processes, and the people who are coming in to check whether or not you got processes in place should be able to literally just look at your work.
Yeah, you should have that. This is use case one when we spoke about publication. The governance
Yeah.
workflow around this. You should have your risk folks being involved with the added benefit. I said that multiple times here. I love those guys because they can create budget out of nothing, right? If you want to do something. So yeah, definitely. But it's highly, in my observation, and I hope I'm wrong, it's highly underused. There is maybe, and I worked on a couple of projects in financial institutions when they get an MRE or some nasty gram from the regulator that they have to do something. and otherwise you have to pay, right? That
Oh yeah.
creates some activity. But otherwise, the typical implementer, the typical process implementation or improvement person doesn't think about that. And that's a shame.
Well, it's like audit support is something you never think about until you're audited. And then
Yeah.
surprise, either you're going to burn a ton of hours trying to satisfy these unexpected requirements, or you can plan for them. Think of them as expected, because for those of you who work in highly regulated industries, that's just going to be a norm for you throughout your entire career. And when you build a solution lifecycle that's robust to this, that's a powerful feature. Now, one of the things that I wanted to move on to the next piece of the puzzle here is one of the things that regulators might look at is the organization itself and how it's laid out. And one of the ways we create that is a term that has been coined and made very popular, which is creating a digital twin of the organization itself. So first and foremost, can you define that for me and tell me how this fits into the solution lifecycle?
So the answer is yes.
Simple enough. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening. It's been great. It's been great to have you here. I've been Jay Emerald. No, yes, tell me a detail.
In all seriousness, I think, and this is a very simplified view of digital twin. I think that the term digital twin of an organization will become much more important in the next couple of years because it has some true benefits. To me, and again, I might be wrong, and I'm happy to have the conversation. To me, it means basically three things. It means to have the ability to depict and bring down to virtual paper what an organization does, how it's structured, how the different parts are wired up. This is all what we spoke about over the last 5 hours in this episode, right? So you need your enterprise baseline, and that is your depiction of this. I think where the quality change comes in is when you add prediction to it, to say, okay, and the analog example would be what we see in engineering, where you have a digital twin of an engine, an aircraft engine that runs on a computer or windmill, because you don't want to climb 400 feet up in the air. That's expensive and dangerous. So you have that run in a computer to see what your maintenance is. Well, you could do the same thing, right? You could have prediction on your output of underwritten contracts, loans, right? Or you could have a prediction on your potential sales or on your production, So it's the same thing. So you need a prediction, and that gives you a curve, right? January to December, and you have a line somehow, maybe a little bit less in summer where everybody's on vacation, and then a little bit more over the holidays because people are in shopping mode, whatever, right? So you get a curve. And the last thing, the third thing is you need to be able to track the performance of these processes. And this is where you have the mining technology coming in, right? And what you see is when you do a prediction, you need obviously a simulation model, right? To say, okay, what does a good process look like? The 5 C's, right? And if you think hard enough, you're pretty sure you have 2-3 more criteria for it. But you tweak it, your prediction, your simulation model according to your desired outcome, the fastest, cheapest, whatever. And then you measure with a mining technology, well, what is the actual performance? Do we meet our SLAs? How long do the cases take? How many variants do we have? That type of stuff. And what you might see is that gives you a curve as well, right? Do we hit our numbers, the benchmarks? In an ideal world, those two lines, prediction and mining, would lay on top of each other. What happens if the actual as is better than your prediction? Well, the logical point is, well, maybe my simulation model is not right.
Right.
What is if it's the other way around? You underperform. Well, then you want to know, well, what went wrong? Why did I underperform? Where? Who? How? Under which circumstances? Internal, external, whatever. So that leads then into another improvement circle, if you will, right? So when I overlay this digital twin over the 5 bubbles in our life cycle, I see 4 of them touched. And the one that's not touched is the implementation, because that's literally the outcome of it. You have an idea for the next iteration that then triggers a change. So it's
Mm-hmm.
enterprise baseline, it's the design, it's the execution for the data, it's the monitoring and analysis.
Yeah.
What do you think about digital twin? It's a marketing term, isn't it?
It is a marketing term, but it also implies something. I think the digital twin of an organization is kind of like your a virtual avatar of it, but also something that is operable, right? Your digital twin should perform as if it is real. And
Mm-hmm.
it's where you can test changes. This is, you think about this a lot, like when you're making a decision for the organization, if you, there's a great shirt that I love, which is that I don't always test my code, but when I do it in prod,
Mm-hmm.
which is my favorite joke of all, because the truth is that as an executive, you're making very difficult decisions you don't really know the outcomes of, because you don't have an understanding of all the variables that the market will provide to you. However, a digital twin is kind of like a test bench. You can put ideas in place and you can see what likely outcomes there would be and create business cases for change that have outcomes that you can be comfortable with in a certain level of certainty. And then you can test back and update your workbench continuously with the real performance. So this digital twin becomes, it's essentially, it is your lever. It's your leverage through
Yeah.
which you can test effective business changes.
But there's also one thing, JM, before you bring us out into the second break of this show here, in regards to the digital twin. And we have one more use case after the break.
Of course.
So I think it's the topic of data quality, right? Because we can talk about simulation, the 5 levers of process. That's relatively easy. But what do you do if your depiction is not right? So your database is incorrect. Your processes are not right. Your applications are not right. Your whatever org is not right. Your depiction is wrong. And the other question is obviously, then do you have the right data from your execution runtime systems that you pull into your mining? Is there a discrepancy? Do cases get lost in all that stuff? Which brings me actually to the point. Well, dear listeners, how good is the quality of your information? Do you have do you have measures in place to make sure that the information is not only complete but it's also correct? Oh, and by the way, what are the means that you have to mitigate if something doesn't fit? And with that, and JM, I took over your job now. With that, we leave you for a moment and we play a little music and we see each other in the last segment of the show with our last use case.
All right, we are back after our second break, and Roland, you implied something at the end of our break that I think is really important to talk about in our final use case and thoughts for this episode. You talked about the word quality, and I think we need to go down that rabbit hole because data quality is a huge issue, but as is that quality of documentation, as is the quality of connection, as is the quality throughout the solution lifecycle. And first and foremost, explain to me what you think about when you think about data quality.
Well, I don't think that the data quality is the key thing. It's just an ingredient of it. I think the overall output is something you should quality measure. And that's mostly driven with your process, right? There's a whole, and that's our last use case, quality management, or I forgot, how did you call it? Enterprise management system?
Something
whatever,
like that,
Anyways, so it's basically that total quality aspect. You try, you aim to do things the best way you can, right? And there's some thought leaders. Some of them are dead, like Edward Demings. Some of them are still alive, but there's a whole discipline around. Yes, we need to measure the quality of the work that we do, the quality of the products that we that we create. And
Yeah.
my idea is, well, obviously to do this, you need to cover, and I put a perfect circle on our life cycle, you need to cover obviously all aspects, right? If
Yeah.
you don't design it well, if you're missing data, guess what? Your implementation might not be the greatest. Your execution definitely won't be the greatest because you create extra work and all those type of things, and your measurement will show it, and then you start the circle again. So I think BPM is a great input for all of those activities. And in a previous project, again, same thing with the German Armed Forces. We said, well, you have your process decomposition, but if you do QM work, right, and we were looking at the quality management module in SAP and then try to apply it to all the processes that we did, it's basically the same thing, but you look at it with a different angle. With a different lens. And then you have that demake cycle, and I would put pictures in the show notes and all that type of stuff that you would apply. So I think that the last use case is that overall management system, right, where you then can get those nice things like certifications, ISO certifications and all that type of stuff, which some industries require. Right, if you bid on something and it's a checkbox that you have an ISO whatever 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever your industry specialty is, you must have it. There's no way going around. And to be quite honest, me as a customer, if I buy something, and we're currently, complete off topic, looking for dog crates in my wife's new car, right? I'm looking at things like crash tests. How are those things done? Is that manufacturer ISO certified? Because then I assume they work with a certain level of quality when they create their products. And at the end of the day, we're talking about a living, breathing thing that's in that crate. And I don't want to get it smashed in a car accident.
It's true. Well, when I think of quality, I used to be a quality assurance analyst. I started my career in management consulting in QA. And one of the things that I was looking for on this whole life cycle is required completeness and accuracy. I say required completeness because that's one thing that is an easy place to trip up. Is completeness is not a full statement. Required completeness is a full statement. I feel like a lot of organizations try and fill out all the black boxes when the truth is that's not actually what's necessary. In fact, from the program roadmap and design, you need to set aside what the order of operations is. And if your documentation isn't there for some of the pieces of the puzzle, that might be fine. That's actually part of the plan because you haven't got the resources to do everything. But where you do have requirements to be complete, it must be complete. The diagrams must be accurate and complete. So they need to accurately represent the business. They need to be semantically correct, so the right connections and types of objects and visualizations. The data underneath it, the required attributes, mandatory details must be filled out in full, and you must have all of those organized into a repository and structure with the connections between them that tell the picture. They give you a picture of the story accurately, and that's a hard thing to do correctly. And that's why you have to track quality. So that's where we put in dashboards, reports, and other sorts of analysis tools to monitor data quality, to monitor completeness, and to monitor the governance life cycle that should really be the controlling mechanism for a lot of the work that the business architects and enterprise architects do inside the solution lifecycle.
And we could overexpose. I hope that's an English word. The governance risk and compliance stuff on that perfect circle as well. Because of course you want to see how is the work planned, how should it be done, and how is it actually done, right? So you have that shortcut, and your conformance check is exactly the same thing, except that you don't look for whatever potential financial risks that could go south or reputational risks or whatnot. You're looking for quality aspects. How many whatever defects do we have in our productions? How many loops do we have rework in our underwriting process? These type of things. It's the same analysis technique, the same technology. It's a different focus on it.
I agree. Well, Roland, I think we've burned brains as much as we can for today, and I wanted to start to bring our episode to a close because this has been really great. But I'll summarize a little bit of the things we talked about today. So we started with a solution lifecycle, right? The 5 pieces, and the order I laid them out in. whether that you agree with it, solution design, implementation, process execution, measurement and analysis, and high-level design and program roadmap. We talked a little bit about, as we sort of drilled into individual uses of each of these pieces of the puzzle, process documentation, publishing, standardization, our good friend Michael Shank's process inventory, the term, and analysis, including things like Lean and Six Sigma. We talked a little bit about how process improvement leads into system implementation that has rollout support to help to run with execution monitoring and perishable insights response. We talked a little bit about customer experience design and how you can control and manage the way in which others interact with your process from their perspective and journey. We talked about regulatory compliance. We talked about the digital twin of an organization. And lastly, we just finished up talking about quality management throughout. Roland, how do you love it, my friend? Yeah, a little bit of brain blowing up after this, but hopefully you've got a sense of sort of what the solution lifecycle looks like, the different use cases and approaches along each of these things. Now, you can find, of course, this graphic on whatsyourbaseline.com. If you're not already going there to take a look at things, I suggest you head over there. And if you're listening to this episode right now, it's likely you interacted with us via LinkedIn. Roland, I think we've been getting a bunch of comments on LinkedIn. You're responding to them.
The more the merrier. And while you're doing it, if you like what you hear, tell your 5 best friends about this podcast. I think I hope it's valuable what we do. At least that's some of the feedback that I paid for that people will give us. No, just kidding. Tell them, right? We like to spread the word. If you like what you hear, tell your 5 best friends about this.
Well, thanks so much, friends, for being here on this journey with us. And go to whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 70 for this particular episode and its show notes. But until we meet again, friends, I've been J.M. Erlandson.
And I'm still Roland Volt.
And we will see you in the next one.